Yeah, money only facilitates the exchange of value and goods. And that's ultimately what I think is important. If you concentrate even today on learning about something and creating value and providing something useful to society, that's what makes you wealthy, I think.
Governments could borrow and print as much currency as it wanted.
They spend more than they tax, the governments, and that's what the central banking fiat currency system allows you to do.
The government is now estimating that it could pay around $900 billion in interest alone.
Yes, money can be corrupted, like you said, that it's been corrupted, it's been turned into nothing.
Money that doesn't actually even exist. Mario, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you, Chris. I hope you're doing well too.
Oh, I'm always well when I get to speak to someone with not just a jolly nice character, but also someone with an incredible wealth of knowledge. The stuff you talk about on your channel, excuse the pun, it is gold. It's kind of like what we all need to know to understand the not just the Babylonian money system, but the encompassing slavery that comes off it. You know, what's your background? How did you get an interest in this and explaining it to people?
Well, I grew up in Brazil, where we had a lot of inflation, so I was always interested in money. I've been in the UK since 1992. I worked in the city for 20 years. And I was involved in the bond markets, which is not a market followed in the mainstream. Whenever you hear people reporting on the radio or the news, they say, oh, the FTSE did this and the pound did this. But the bond market is where they set the price of credit. It's very important. I have a university degree in international relations and economics, but I would say that I've learned more from asking questions and doing my own research that I learned at university. And when I was still in the city, I started questioning the system, the structure of the monetary system, and I started looking into it privately. And ever since I've left the city, I've been able to try to tell the public what the monetary system is all about. And like you said, the Babylonian system that we have that actually enslaves the majority of people and leaves the 0.1% with all the wealth. And it's, I'm sorry to say, it's a scam. And the thing is, most people are too worried about paying their bills to have time to look into these things. So I'm fortunate that I've, not totally fortunate, it's just that I ask questions and I like looking into things, and that's what I've done. And that's what I try to tell my viewers about. I follow the markets, but these markets are ultimately controlled by the people who control the money or the currency.
As I was saying to Mario earlier, I read this fascinating book that was recommended to me by one of our guests, Mike McCarthy. It's called The Babylonian Woe, and I can only remember about 2% of this book, folks. Probably not even that. But what I got from it is the money system goes back to sort of 8,000 years ago. Let's just say, for example, back then, they would use things like cockle shells as a simple system of exchange. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But if I can't scratch yours, I'll give you 2 cockle shells. And these shells can be used anywhere in the region, perhaps, almost, internationally in regions like the Middle East. And that 2 cockle shells is recognized. That's a scratch of the back, or paint your fence, or fix your window, or sell you a chicken, whatever it might be. And then the money merchants got involved, or the greed mongers, and they thought, right, we'll start a ledger and we'll lend cockle shells out to people that don't have them. And when they come to pay them back, instead of we lend 8 cockle shells, we get 8 back. We're going to lend 8 and we're going to get 10 back. Known in biblical terms as usury, banned, I still believe, in certain countries in the Middle East. Money lending, folks, is what we're saying. Almost recognized in the Bible, in one of the stories in there, that usury would lead to the enslavement of mankind. And as this went forward, they took this system into the churches and the palaces, and they convinced the leaders of the time and the religious leaders that your wealth doesn't lie in looking after your people. Your wealth lies in accumulating these cockle shells. You know, the start of materialism, folks. Cockle shells obviously naturally turn to, or eventually turn to gold, silver, precious metals, gems. And so you had these people that should be looking after you suddenly convinced by these very clever money people that no, your wealth, your importance comes from how much gold you've got down in the vaults, and funnily enough, we'll control that for you. And then, of course, that's come forward through the centuries, Mario, and we've seen fractional reserve banking, so lending out this stuff money that doesn't actually even exist. We saw the start of the central banking system. I've said enough just to give. Oh, and of course, we're now moving into ultimate form of money that doesn't exist, which is digital money. Mario, that in itself, and I don't understand bonds. I have a rough idea of shares and all. I don't think I need to know that to know we got a serious problem here.
What you said about the cockle shells is interesting. I've read up a lot on the Austrian School of Economics, and they have a regression theorem analysis. So you go back to see how things started and then come forward. And that's what they've done with money. And money started, actually before money, you had direct exchange, which is barter. So like you said, if you were, I don't know, you had a farm and you had eggs, and then you needed to get some milk from another farmer, but the farmer that had the milk didn't want eggs. So that was a problem. Bartering is always a problem. And what the Austrians talk about is what evolved through time, and it can be anything, was the most marketable commodity. It's a commodity that everyone wants, and that actually you don't actually consume it. And that's what money is. And yes, money can be corrupted. Like you said, that it's been corrupted. It's been turned into nothing. But I think also there's a good part of money, which means that people can specialize and people can trade from different locations to others, because a lot of places, let's say, have something that you might want here in England that we don't have. So I think money is a good thing. It allows for specialization. I think we'd still be in caves or very primitive if we didn't have the concept of money. But the whole problem has been that, like you said, it's been corrupted.
With rising inflation, bank failures, and massive layoffs across multiple sectors, the future of the economy remains uncertain. It's no wonder the central banks have been getting prepared by stockpiling gold. At ITM Trading, we have spent over 27 years building a team of seasoned researchers and analysts who can help you prepare for any financial crisis. Our experts are ready to provide you with proven strategies to safeguard your wealth and assets in the event of an economic downturn or currency reset, which is frankly inevitable. Don't wait until it's too late. Schedule your free gold and silver strategy call by clicking on the link in the description below.
Yeah, money only facilitates the exchange of value and goods. And that's ultimately what I think is important. If you concentrate even today on learning about something and creating value and providing something useful to society. That's what makes you wealthy, I think. And the money comes naturally with that, because more people will want to exchange with you. But what we have today, though, is the central banks that started out in the 17th century. I think Sweden had the first central bank, but then you had the Bank of England in 1694. And what they've done is first of all, we need to understand central banks, they're only there because the government gives them the monopoly. In the case of the Bank of England, it was the Royal Charter in 1694. And what we had here was a marriage between these money lenders that you talk about and the government. And why do they do that? Well, because the money lenders benefit from the fact that they're lending to a nation. And when you lend to nations, you make a lot more profit. The monarch or the president or whatever, the government has the power of taxation. So it's almost like the bankers will never lose out, because the head of state can always tax, and they can always find crises to justify the taxation and the national debt. Prior to central banks, if a king or a queen wanted to go to war, they couldn't lumber it all on the public, and there wasn't a national debt. But that's what the central bank has allowed the bankers and governments to do, to increase the national debt. And the national debt in 1694 was £2 million. Now it's approaching £3 trillion. And we finance that national debt through inflation, through taxation. We've got the highest taxation in 70 years in the UK. And in government is really big as well. It's more than 50% of GDP. And inflation, as you've seen, is reflected in higher prices. That's the other thing they try to fool you. They tell you that food prices or wages cause inflation, but it's not. It's the fact that the central banks, they can issue all this credit and money out of thin air to buy the government's debt, which are called bonds. And then the government receives this funny money and spends it. And the people in the banking, at the top in the banking community and the corporations around it, they get to use that money first. So, and we get to use it later, and it becomes less valuable. And so in a world that I think would be more just, you wouldn't have central banks. You would have a free market in money, and government wouldn't be involved. And some people might think we have a free market now, that the corporations are too powerful, but they're only powerful because they're actually connected to the government. So that's how I see it in a nutshell. So maybe if you have some more questions.
Yes. Could you, Mario, for those of us that haven't put as much thought to these subjects as we'd probably like to, what the hell is the Nash? When you hear about America saying it's the richest, most powerful country on the planet, could you explain what that means for us?
Yeah, so the national debt is composed of how much the government borrows and has to keep borrowing. And why is that? Well, because they don't even have enough. They spend more than they tax the governments. And that's what the central banking fiat currency system allows you to do. And why do they do that? And why do they love this? Because, well, they can buy votes, they can enrich their friends, their donors. So let's say that you have your budget, you spend, I don't know, £10,000 a year, and you take in £10,000. So you're fine. You're running a balanced budget. But if you start spending more than you earn, let's say you spend 12,000, then you have a debt of 2,000. So what you will do, you'll go to the central bank, or a bank in your case, and they'll lend you £2,000. But instead, you'd probably be thinking, well, I need to pay this off. And individuals usually want to pay off their debt. But with the government, they just keep accumulating it. And why do they do that? Well, because it benefits the governments, because they keep borrowing and they keep buying votes. They keep
Keep looking good.
Yeah, and it benefits the bankers because they keep the bigger the debt, the more interest they get on it. And the reason also they tax you is to make sure that they can control the inflation a little bit, because if they create too much of this debt and government spends too much, it might dilute the currency, and it does. So they tax you. So they never let you, and the taxation as well, I would say, is to keep the general public always never having time to sit down and think and about things, always being worried about their bills. Because can you imagine if you didn't have to pay any tax, how much more time you'd have, and you wouldn't have any worries. It wouldn't be good for the accountancy business, but it would be good for the general public. And that's the national debt. And in the U.S., actually, in 1835 or 36, one of those 2 years, Andrew Jackson actually paid off the national debt. And he actually did not renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, because the United States had the First Bank of the United States. That chartered ended in 1812. And then I think it was restarted in 1816, the Second Bank. So the U.S. had two central banks in the beginning of its existence. Andrew Jackson didn't renew the charter, paid off the national debt. But unfortunately, in 1913, they created the Federal Reserve. That's the third central bank. And is it a coincidence that we had World War I start right after the Fed? Fed was created because they helped finance that. And usually the national debt is accumulated. The wars really add to the national debt. The Napoleonic Wars added a lot to the UK debt, even though they paid off quite a bit of it in the 19th century. But then you had World War I, and the national debt went through the roof, not just here, but in the US. And I guess what we had in 2020, that was kind of like a war, I would say, and that added massively to the national debt as well. The Bank of England created £500 billion to buy government bonds, and they spent all this money, so to speak, to keep people at home for 240 days, doing nothing but still buying things. And is it any wonder prices are rising now?
I had a cheap Thai meal yesterday in the market. I used to love it, Mario, because it cost £5 for a big bowl of Thai food. It's 10 quid now, you know, in like in 2 years. It's so much more. So essentially you've got the banking fraternity lending, doing these deals with the government, essentially to make money off the people. The same people who are in government they're in the same network as
I mean, look at Tony Blair. After he left as prime minister, he got a job with JP Morgan, and he was earning £2 million a year. And I heard when I worked in the city from people that worked at JP Morgan that all he did was go into his office for a few hours a week, and the junior people would to come to his office and say, "Oh, Mr. Blair, would you like a cup of tea and stuff?" That's all he did, and it's a revolving door, and
that was basically his reward for another bankers' war, which was Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's right. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of Smedley Butler. He wrote War is a Racket. He was a brigadier general. He was one of the most decorated U.S. Marines. And he realized later on in life that he'd been fighting for Wall Street and the bankers, not for freedom or democracy. They always have that excuse. And I know it's difficult to tell people because, a lot of people here in this country, their grandparents and great-grandparents fought in wars. And my wife, always said, well, my grandfather and great grandfather. They thought they were fighting for something, to save democracy and freedom, but unfortunately, it wasn't.
No, Mary, you don't have to hold back on this show because I'm ex-military. I quote unquote put my life on the line on active service, and I think it's your duty as a veteran to learn this stuff. Although we all get it, we know what it's like to have lost colleagues. It's very highly traumatic for life, but it's also simultaneously you're cementing the next bankers' wars for them because they laugh at you. They literally belong to the same club, and they despise you. They did to you that you're just pawns on the pawns on the chessboard. So I think it's
Pawns in the Game. That's a really good book. You should look into.
So I totally get Smedley Butler getting to the end of a military career, looking back and going, I've been used, haven't I?
Just wanted to go back to the national debt because some people might be asking, why don't we just abolish or like default on the national debt? Recently in the US, they had this debt ceiling crisis, and a lot of people were saying, are they going to default? What's going to happen? The flip side of the national debt is the money that we use, the currency. Every pound in existence has been borrowed into existence by not just the government, but also the private banks. So if you, let's say, default on the national debt, it's going to hurt a lot of people because you have a welfare state. You have so many people now dependent on the government. So, the private economy has been crowded out. So that's the problem with the national debt. But I'm afraid as well that it's just pure maths when your debt increases so much and your income doesn't keep up. There's going to be a point where you won't be able to service it anymore. And I think we are at that point. And the way they keep it going is by issuing more and more debt and having excuses like we had in 2020 and we have now with the Ukraine. And they keep justifying all this debt. But eventually, the private economy won't be able to keep up servicing that debt. And I have a feeling it's all going to collapse, just like it almost did in Greece in 2011, 2012. I think it would have been a good thing for Greece if they had defaulted on their debt. But unfortunately, the bankers always seem to be in charge, like in Italy. Some years ago, they have what they call caretaker prime ministers, and they usually come from places like Goldman Sachs or other banks. We have Rishi Sunak. You could say he's a caretaker prime minister, like in Italy, because he wasn't elected to be prime minister. So that's the thing. The problem with the national debt, they make the country so dependent on it that it's really hard to wean off the national debt. And if you do, that's why you should never believe when politicians, I'm hearing Jeremy Hunt say a lot, oh, we're going to pay down the debt. He's not going to pay it down. What he means is he's going to inflate the system so much that the pound in your pocket is going to become worth less and less, like your dinner last night. And the debt, and when that happens, the debt becomes easier to service because it becomes worth less. But he's actually not going to try to run budget surpluses and actually pay it off like we do. He's just going to inflate it away. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, it's like trying to pay off your mortgage, but instead of actually paying off the loan, you use that money for something else, and then you go back to the bank and say, "Can I actually have a bigger mortgage now, please?" And
well, you can actually, if you do well enough, for example, in terms of buying your house, and you pay off some of your mortgage, and then the value of the house goes up like it has been, for the last 25 years. What you can do, you sell the house, pay the mortgage off, and buy a house with not a mortgage. So you can use this system to your advantage as well.
Mario, let's talk about again, for our friends at home, how was the gold and silver, leached out of the system? And how do we end up at a point of fractional reserve banking where you've got the banks lending out money that they don't even have, but then charging us interest on that withdrawal or on that loan?
Yeah, well, the gold and silver, I think, have been hijacked by governments. Gold and silver became money not because of governments. They became money in a free market, I would say. And what governments have done over the centuries is when they start wars, they usually suspend, if you have a currency, if the government, they suspend the convertibility of that currency that the banks issue. And by suspending convertibility, it means that they don't allow people to get their gold or silver if they go to the bank. So, and why do they do that? Well, because it's the only way to finance wars. But what happened after the end of the wars, they would go back to normal money, gold and silver. And the banknotes were just promissory notes for you to go back to your bank and say, I want my money back. So like after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a period from 1797 during the Napoleonic Wars till 1821 where they stopped the convertibility because the government had to basically take the gold and silver to finance the war. But after the war finished, they went back on a sound money system. And that's how it always happened. But unfortunately, after World War I, they tried to go back to a gold and silver system. The problem was that World War I was so expensive that Churchill, as a chancellor, tried to go back at the old exchange rate, and it didn't work. And then they just gave up on the gold standard in 1931. The silver, and I've got here a crown from George III, as you can see here. The silver used to be 925. What does 925 mean? It's sterling. It's the sterling silver content of the coins in the UK were 925 until 1919. So after World War I, the government spent so much and destroyed so much, and unfortunately a lot of people died. They had to debase the silver coins. So what do they do? Well, they still minted crowns, but it only had half of the silver. And that lasted until 1946. And then after 1947, and that date is important because you had World War II, they kept minting these, but they took all the silver out. So that's how they took all the silver out of our money. And the gold, they just suspended it, and you just kept using the promissory notes. If you look at your Bank of England note today, it still says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. And that meant that you could go to any bank and get 10 sovereigns. But I've called the Bank of England before on the phone and said, what do you mean by this promise? And they said, well, it just means you can exchange this for a new note if it gets damaged. And I said, so why don't you write that on the note? Because this is misleading. So, yeah, I'm saying it here. The Bank of England note is fraudulent. So there you go. So I realized that back in 2004 when I was at work. I went to get my lunch and I was getting some money out of my wallet. And I just looked at it. And I had started looking into this already. And I saw that promissory note. And the notes back then, you probably remember, were bigger, so you could see it clear. And I said, wow. And then a few months later, I got involved into looking at the Libertarian Party. And I went to London for like a conference, and Boris Johnson was there speaking at this Libertarian do. And then there was an economist there, Samuel Britton. I think he's passed away. He used to be an economist for the FT. And I took my 20-pound note out and I asked him the question about the system being completely fraudulent. And he looked at me and just like basically said, "Oh, what are you talking about?" and just walked away. Didn't want to like discuss it.
I'm meeting a chap today, funnily enough, and he met one of the architects of one of the major events of our lifetime. He welcomed him into his business, had to do a presentation for this guy and his little clique of people, and he said something like, "You know, the bullshit around those three numbers, folks. You know those three numbers." And this guy, who was one of the architects of that event, looked at my friend and said, "What? Are you a conspiracy theorist?"
Yeah.
Again, the fascinating thing that when we go and we say we borrow money for our mortgage, the bank don't have that money. They just...
Yeah, a lot of people normally what it should be, let's say you put like £100,000 in the bank for saving, and you say, I want to put it there for 5 years, at 3%. So what most people think is that the bank takes that 100,000 and lends it to Mr. Smith at 4% for a mortgage, but they don't. Like you said, they just write down 100,000, and it's what William Patterson said in 1694, the bank hath benefit of interest created from money out of nothing. And that's what it's not just the central bank, but the commercial banks, they create it out of nothing, and they take your house, your property as collateral. So if you default on it, they own something for nothing.
Yes, they... So that's fractional reserve banking. I remember watching this incredible video that said when they brought the central banking system into the USA, they picked the banking community. So, I suppose these elite, what originally would have been European families, aristocracy, the banking aristocracy. They picked a day when everybody was distracted by a certain event. I can't remember what it was, but it was a big event. And they made their way to a place called Jekyll Island under false identities. So no one would know who these bankers were. They sat down at a table on their own and said, right, we're going to start the Federal Reserve. And then we're just going to tell the government they have to have it. And the government went, oh, okay, we'll sign that one off. Can you tell us a bit about why is the Fed and the Bank of England and all these central banks, why are they, not in our interest?
Well, because basically the central banks, as I said earlier, is a collection of the private bankers, and they work together with government. And what the structure does is that it privatizes profits. So the bankers always, when they make profits, they keep those profits. But if they have a problem, because this fractional reserve system is very fragile, you can have a lot of crises. So when you do, you have what's called the lender of last resort. The central bank will come and save the private bankers, and the governments will say, oh, we need to borrow a bit more. So they'll just issue more credit, and the government will spend more and bail out the banks. So that's called socializing the losses. So basically, the private banks create the central banks in order to make sure that if their highly immoral fractional reserve game goes wrong, the public gets left with the bill, and they always find a crisis to justify that. And then, but when they make a lot of profits, they keep those profits. So I think that's the reason for the central bank. And there's a really good book called Our Crowd by Stephen Birmingham. And he wrote about all the major families that created this Federal Reserve. And in one section of the book, he talks about a banker called August Belmont, who actually was sent to the U.S. in 1837 by the Rothschilds. And in 1837, there was a huge banking crisis collapse in the U.S. And August Belmont, who was very young at the time, he was able, with Rothschild money, to buy all these assets for pennies on the dollar. And in the book, though, it says, because the book is written by this guy in the 1960s, and he interviewed actually members of these families, like old aunts and grandmas and stuff. And the book said, August Belmont and the Rothschilds acted like the Federal Reserve. They came in and bailed out everyone, after this crisis in New York and in the financial system in 1837. So the Federal Reserve in 1910, you had the bankers, and they were the same people from this crowd, our crowd. They're meeting in Jekyll Island. So why do they meet there? What was the excuse for having a central bank? Well, because in 1907, there's a huge crash that was triggered by the earthquake in San Francisco. And J.P. Morgan, he had to come in and bail everyone out, organize the bailout. And I think J.P. Morgan, many people don't know, J.P. Morgan Bank started out in London. And I think the Rothschilds are heavily behind the J.P. Morgans. So I think what happened in 1907, the bankers said to themselves, we need to do something about this. We almost lost everything in 1907. So they came up with the idea of a central bank in the U.S. to make sure that when they did have trouble with their schemes, that the public would come to the rescue through the central bank. And the way they sold the central bank was to say that they're going to make the currency more flexible, that it would end bank runs and collapses, but it didn't do any of that. I mean, last March this year, we had one of the 2-3 biggest collapses in banking in the U.S. The currency has lost 99% of its value since the Federal Reserve was created. When they finally were able to write the Federal Reserve Act, they put it to a vote in Congress on December 23rd, 1913. And back then, there were no flights or airplanes, and travel took a long time. So most of the people in Congress had gone home for Christmas already, and that's how they sneaked it through. And the president, of course, was Woodrow Wilson, and he was, you could argue, bought and paid for by the bankers. He was put there by the bankers. So he made sure that he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. And he actually, I don't have the comment here, but he quoted, he said that was the biggest mistake he made. I mean, you could look that up, Woodrow Wilson, on his regret about signing the Federal Reserve Act. And there were a lot of people back then who were in Congress who tried to warn people against the Federal Reserve. But again, they were dismissed as well as being, conspiracy theorists, even though I don't think they had that term at the time. One of them was Congressman Charles Lindbergh, who was the father of the aviator, the guy who flew across the Atlantic. And ironically, Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, married the daughter of a J.P. Morgan partner. So there you go.
It's quite fascinating when you see how the big club, they network and they get their we say grubby mitts into into everyone else's family fortunes. And also the thing, I think, if I understand it right, with this central banks, is because they control the base rate, the interest rate. When they raise it, as we saw this in the 90s, when I managed to buy a house for a third of its value, because the poor people that bought it brand new 9 months before me, they'd mortgaged up to the hilt like most people do, because you don't think it's ever going to happen. The rate went up. This poor couple with their first brand new house couldn't afford a mortgage that has gone, let's say in modern times, from £1,000 a month. It's suddenly gone to 3,000. You just know who can So the banks repossessed their poor house, and then they sold it to me at a third of the price. Now, if you have that control over the interest rate, Mario, am I right in thinking when you put it up, there isn't the money in circulation to pay these debts back, so people default, and then the big companies, remember, it's all a big club, folks. It's all one big network. They say, oh, right, we'll hoover up all these small independent cafes in the high street, and guess what's coming? We're going to put a big Costa coffee there. You know, you see, they've sucked all that wealth up into their network, and they replace it with their corporatized. You know, the same with the pub. I mean, it's slightly different, but we've lost all the pub.
It's all a matter of maths. A little bit on the fractional reserve system and how it favors the bankers, and over centuries it basically enslaves the general public. So I'll give you an example. Let's say a farmer has a farm that's worth £100, and he grows wheat there, or she grows wheat, and the yield from the farm every year is 3 or 4%. So they make a fairly decent living. And then you have the banker who, let's say, takes in £100 in deposit, let's say the Bank of England or a commercial bank, and they'll lend £1,000 on the back of that, and they'll lend it to you at 5-6%. So they're making like multiple times of what the farmer is making. And when you control that for centuries, is it any wonder that, the bankers almost own everything now in the big corporations, and the landowners, the farmers, they don't have as much as they used to. So it's just a matter of math. You extrapolate that fractional reserve. It's worse than I would say a loan shark, because a loan shark at least has the money to lend to you. The bankers don't. And they actually make de facto more interest, because they're making 5 or 6%, not on 100, but on 1,000, and they've only got 100. So that's how we've come to where we are right now. And I don't think the political system will help any. Even the Labour Party, who's supposed to be a party for the people, he's come out and said that he wants to, Starmer, that is, to buy land from landowners at below market value. You know, how is that fair? And the reason people are so hard up is not because of, it's because of the system. That's what it is. And I'm afraid to say the political system is also a distraction to divide people, so people don't look at this problem, which is the money system. That's the big problem. And why do I think it's the biggest problem? Well, because half of all, when you do a commercial transaction, half of that transaction is to do with money. So like you said, if the bankers control the base rate and the loans and the currency, and it's a monopoly, they control everything.
Exactly. There's 3 things I'll come on to, Mario, and I am aware of you kindly giving us all this time. And I'll name them in no particular order, but one of them is BRICS, and I'm going to hold my hand up and say I keep hearing it mentioned. I honestly don't know anything about it. The second thing is the petrodollar, and how that related, for example, to Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, who I believe didn't want to trade their oil in the dollar. And then the final thing, it wouldn't be right if we didn't talk about central banking, digital currencies, and the way the whole digital ID thing is going. So should we take BRICS or the petrodollar first?
We'll go to BRICS then. BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it was actually thought up by an economist from Goldman Sachs, an English economist for Goldman Sachs. and but it's been used now by those countries to create a bloc to challenge basically the G7. And why is that? Well, because the G7 used to be very powerful in the 80s and 90s, but the economic growth of China, India, Russia, Brazil has made them, relatively more important, and they want to have a say. So they've created this bloc. They're talking about creating their own reserve currency. And why is that? Well, because the dollar has been used as a weapon against these countries. And I'm not taking sides. I'm just telling you why it's happening. So that's the BRICS in a nutshell. The petrodollar, we have to go back to 1971. And why is that? Well, that's when Richard Nixon closed the gold window. That's how they call it. But because from 1944, when towards the end of World War II, they created the Bretton Woods system. And under that system, the dollar, $35 were backed by 1 troy ounce of gold. So the world was basically on a semi-gold standard. And why semi? Because all the other currencies weren't on a gold standard, but they were pegged to the dollar. But by 1971, the United States had printed too many dollars without backing. And the French, the British, and other countries were going to the treasury with their paper dollars and saying, I want my gold. And they didn't have enough gold. The U.S. would have gone bust if Nixon, he said he was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold temporarily. And here we are in 2023, and it's still suspended. So, this is about the petrodollar, of course. So what happened after 1971? Well, the dollar became very weak. It dropped a lot versus gold. And people, like in Europe, wanted to reinstate a gold standard in Europe. And it would have put a lot of the power of the U.S. It would have eradicated a lot of the power of the U.S. So people didn't trust the dollar anymore because it wasn't backed by anything. So the Americans found a way to increase demand for dollars. So they went to the Saudis and said, we will protect your kingdom and, from enemies, but the condition is that you sell all your oil in dollars. And what does that do? Well, that means that every country in the world that buys oil, and the reason why it becomes important is because Saudi Arabia is the biggest producer. So even other countries that produce oil started dealing in dollars. And when they receive those dollars, what do they do with it? Well, they go and buy, let's say, U.S. government bonds, and it keeps interest rates low. So that's what the petrodollar did. It was basically a way to support the dollar after, it defaulted on its gold obligations. But and America has had the privilege basically to issue the dollar and buy anything they want anywhere else, while other countries like the UK and anyone else, if we want to buy something from abroad, we have to earn in dollars to pay for everything. Every good thing comes to an end. And the flip side of this privilege the US has had is that they've indebted themselves up to here. Like you said, the national debt is like 32 trillion. It's probably going to go to 34 in the next 18 months. And so I go back to the BRICS. The BRICS, Saudi Arabia wants to join now the BRICS. And they realize that the dollar is not as good as gold anymore. They issued too many of it. And the petrodollar is on its way out. So what that will mean for the dollar and for Americans is that there's going to be less demand for dollars. So everything's going to be more expensive for them. And because interest rates are going to go up. And it's going to be the same thing for us here because our currency and the European currencies were always backed by a lot of dollars. And and your third question was about,
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
So So the club, as I call it, so these European aristocracy bankers, do they not, through their network, control Saudi Arabia and was it Brazil?
Russia, China.
Right.
Yeah, I think they do, because you look back and some people might find it strange, but the Americans financed the communists, and they finance also the nationalists, in the civil war in China. Nixon went to China and back in the 70s for détente with China. Up until then, in the UN, China was Taiwan. And then Nixon changed all that. So yeah, they control them as well. But I think the power is shifting to those countries, and they're probably involved with these countries too, these families, but they don't care because they will make probably a lot of money from the BRICS. It's the general public that's going to suffer.
So sorry to interrupt, Mary, but just for our friends at home to understand. So the club folks, this elitist network that seems certainly to have been very strong in the last 400 years, but as we've established, actually goes probably right back to the original corruption of the money system. They're not just happy to destroy Europe, to level it flat. Millions upon millions of deaths of all peoples, including whichever, nationality they belong to. And they've done that twice now. But then they moved on to America and used the good, beautiful people of America, who are very humble and, could we say, a bit naive, because they love their country. And why wouldn't you? It's a beautiful country, and Americans are such nice people. But they've then used the Americas' sense of national pride against them to keep their, Star-Spangled Banner flying, but at the same time as leeching everything from under them, so that their country is now just about to collapse with the biggest debt of all.
Yeah. Well, they did that. They did that to the British Empire and the British people.
Yeah. Now they moved on to China. China's the player that.
It's weird because if you look at the Oxford University, for example, they have something called the Rhodes Scholarship that was created by the Rhodes Trust, Cecil Rhodes, and that's supposed to finance American students to come and study at Oxford. And Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar and so on. And did you know that Oxford University now has also a Rhodes Scholarship for Chinese students? These are not Taiwan students. And it's financed by Blackstone, a huge private equity group. So they keep telling us that China's bad, we're going to go to war, but they're still dealing with the Chinese. And back in the 30s, the Wall Street bankers, they financed Germany. They built up Germany. In the last 25 years, they've built up China, Russia, and now they're our biggest enemies. I think it's just a game for them. And but they make it seem that it's real for us, for the general public.
And if we look at all of that history, Cecil Rhodes, and we had the East India Company, basically the front. I call it the club because it's just this.
Yeah, like clearly, George Carlin said,
it's a big club. Yeah, yeah. And there's different layers of the club. There's the real clever people. Well, don't even want to say that. But then they have their layers of what we just call them puppets of different intelligence. Some of them not really. Not really that smart at all. Not referring to two generations of American president there, but my point is this system of just don't like to use that word. Let's just say raking the heart you're raking the wealth out of these countries, the gold out of South Africa, the diamonds, the incredible mineral wealth that they have down there in Africa, the fish, the copper. Now it's I mean, it's nothing new, is it? So when you mention there's a Cecil Rhodes, yeah, I absolutely have, you know, I have no doubt.
Yeah. And so we covered BRICS, petrodollar. What was the
we were going to do the central banking digital currency.
Oh yeah, CBDCs. Yeah, I think, you know, if we look back at money, and like we have, I spoke about how it used to be golden, you know, gold and silver coins, and then they issued the warehouse receipts, and then the governments hijacked that and took the gold and silver out of the system. So you had to have the warehouse receipts as money, because the cash that we have today, the banknotes, they're not really money. So CBDC would just be the next step in taking away from real value, which is gold and silver. And yeah, and it would put you in a prison, because if you did something that the bankers, and that's not just government, but the banks as well, because they'll follow all these rules. If you did something that they didn't think was right, they can freeze your account. But if you have cash, you can keep cash outside the system. And that's why I tell a lot of my viewers that you need to have some physical gold and silver coins. That's why I like having some of these, and I have threepenny bits as well, 3 pence. They're all silver coins. So yeah, that's what the CBDC will do. It will be a total, I guess, total slavery, I would say. And I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but that's what it means, the CBDC.
Well, you're not being dramatic, because, I mean, let's be honest, we are talking about the again, I don't want to say the words, folks, because it triggers certain software, but, you know, we are talking about the NWO.
Yeah.
They have a gameplay. You don't play Monopoly and everyone who sits at the table, you know, drinking their sherry at Christmas, like, nobody wants to win it. There's always that person, isn't there, that, well, you don't care and you're dropping your money in your houses everywhere because you're a bit pissed. They've got the, you know, the money up their sleeve, under the table. They are going to win at every cost. Life is no different, especially when you have this strata of individuals that think the rest of the world is scum. That think by birthright you're really undeserving, and you're just, is it chattel? Is that the word? Like cattle?
Yeah,
you know, for their own amusement. And what with you know, populations and stuff, it's not difficult to see why, if you're in this elite club, you might want to get rid of a few people before they concrete like the whole planet, before they eat the whole of the rainforest. Because you know, I don't think you're being dramatic at all, Mario. I think these are incredibly real issues. I say, I was chatting with Mick yesterday, and we were just saying how it's all well and good saying digital currency's fine, and you have it on a, you know, just have a card, or
yeah,
wherever.
it's always convenience, isn't it? Yeah. They sell convenience.
They sell that on convenience, but the problem is when it's all controlled by a central system, you could rock up to do your supermarket shopping, and suddenly, and this is just an example, folks, I know the supermarket girl isn't going to say this, but, you know, your credit is declined. And when you say, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? I've got loads of money in the bank. They say, I'm sorry, Mr. Thrall, did you attend a protest in London last week? You know, were you objecting to, you know, maybe a certain procedure that they want to, that the whole population's going to be? Yeah, I was actually.
Yeah.
There you go, sir.
Well,
you know?
I was reading something, an article someone sent me just before we came on, and it was about Goldman Sachs. They work with Apple in the U.S. to provide people an Apple Bank, savings bank, and an Apple debit or credit card. And a lot of people were complaining they couldn't move their money from their Apple, i.e. Goldman Sachs accounts. And one of the things that people at Goldman Sachs said is that they have to maybe sometimes conduct anti-money laundering and know your client things, which is basically banks shouldn't be involved in that. That's for the police, I would say, if you are a criminal. But what happened is people got their money blocked at Apple Bank because, let's say, you put $10,000 in your bank, Apple Bank, or 10,000 pounds, and then you take that and you transfer it to another account. It will trigger these anti-money laundering things, and they'll freeze your account. So it's not just the government, but these banks are going to be doing that too. The thing is, if it's your money, they shouldn't do that. It's like when you go to your bank now, if you go to the branch and you want to take, let's say, 2,000 pounds cash, they ask you so many questions. And a lot of times I just say, it's none of your business. It's my money, but I'm afraid, they're going to get a lot tougher. So what's the way to take? The other problem is if you take your cash out of the bank, which I think is not a bad thing to have some cash, but they could also demonetize it. In India, they did that a few years ago. They gave people 48 hours to exchange their banknotes for new ones. So they can control you.
Am I right in thinking or suggesting if it's a central banking digital currency, then technically the central banks of the world could unite in governing it and the dealing?
Yeah.
So it really would be like the new world.
Yeah, and the bank that would run that would be the BIS in Basel, the Bank for International Settlements, which was created in 1930 by an international treaty in The Hague by the major European countries and the bankers. And but I think I've read up on the Bitcoin, the Bank of England digital currency. They would be, of course, behind it, like you said, but the wallets they would outsource that to private companies or to normal banks. But ultimately, and they say in their white paper, the Bank of England, that they wouldn't have access. The private companies would be in charge of the accounts, so they wouldn't see anything. But I can bet, they will have access to it. This is just them trying to say, "Oh no, it's not going to be any bad because you're going to have your own private wallet supporters, digital wallet providers, and we're not going to do anything." But I think it's a nefarious endeavor by the central bankers, and many people think they'll bring it in by bringing in a collapse of this fiat currency system, and it's possible. But the other danger for them, though, is that people wake up, and that's why I keep doing my videos and I'm coming on your show. If people wake up and they realize that they're doing this by design, and when the crisis happens and they come out and say, "Oh, this is the solution to it, the CBDC," hopefully a lot of people will say, "No, I don't want to deal with you anymore. You created this collapse, and we don't want your solution." And of course, they're going to try to blame anyone but themselves. They'll blame Russia or aliens for the collapse or anything, but they are actually the ones behind it.
You mentioned people should buy gold and silver or have some of it. Would that be any use if the money system collapsed tomorrow and people, let's just say within a week, are starving and their families are, within 3 weeks, the family's starting to die? I just see rampaging gangs.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I agree with you. And there's a really good book written by Lionel Shriver. She's an American author, but she lives in the UK, called The Mandibles. I recommend it. And it's like dystopian, like you're describing there. But for example, I have a viewer from Kent, and I talked about the threepenny bits that I bought a few weeks ago, the silver ones. And they have a farm, and they said, Mario, whenever you want to come over, we will gladly sell you our eggs and strawberries for silver. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it could come in handy, but like you said, in a Mad Max world, it wouldn't really help. But I think if we're able to get through the troubles and a better world, then you will still have that to be able to use that for your advantage, and also to help people. It's not just for you, because when gold and silver, they never really lose their value. You find coins that have been buried for thousands of years, and so the reason, I mean, I don't tell people to buy gold and silver. I tell them what I'm doing, and I try to tell them what it's about, and a lot of them do. And it's also a protection against inflation, because they're going to continue to issue a lot of the currency, because it's the debt, and they have to keep it going. And it's just a simple law of supply and demand. The more you supply of something, i.e. the currency, the less valuable it becomes. And gold and silver are, they're not really easy to come by. They're rare, and that's why they're money.
Yeah. Friends, I wasn't trying to be scaremongering then. I believe we create our own future, and we do it by making the spiritual connection, which all this fear drops away. Because, for example, and I have a feeling Mario would agree with me here, when Mario mentioned Keith Starmer, I honestly didn't know who he was. I know he's in the news a lot.
Yeah, Keith Starmer,
yeah, but I don't watch mainstream media, folks. You know,
my wife and I haven't watched. We haven't had a TV license since 2015, and we don't watch TV.
Good,
but
this is
a glimpse of news. But yeah. I agree with you. Is you have to switch off, and because they want to keep you in fear, and fear is not a good emotion.
Lionel Shriver's interesting. Didn't she write "We Need to Talk About Kevin"?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Which was
I didn't read that one, but one of my viewers recommended The Mandibles, and that's really a good one.
Yeah, it seems I can't get too deep into this, folks, for the same reasons, but it's interesting. We were talking yesterday, Mario, in the podcast, but I mean, I'm an author of 6 books. I actually best-selling. I was #2 best-selling author in Hong Kong for a while, but here's the thing. It's incredibly hard work. My suggestion is, I think the books get picked again by the network. When you see books like the other one about the apocalypse was The Road, wasn't it, by Cormac McCarthy, about this dystopian future where there'd been some big disaster. You never got to know what it was. And Lionel Shriver, she's written this apocalyptic book, but she also wrote one about a guy that went a bit banzai in school. If you know, I'm just saying,
yeah, I wouldn't put it. Yeah,
people will put narratives in your head, folks, and you don't even know it.
That's true.
You don't even know it. So I think we're all agreed. A good place to start, Mario, isn't it? Is turn off that. Don't stop listening to that mainstream. Don't be the person that has the BBC as your source of information, even if it's like, but I just wind down, Chris, at the end of the day. I don't take it sick. Come on, you do, don't you? Let's be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, BBC. I mean, it's such a. I mean, you look at they're run by the bankers too. I think some years ago, the head of the BBC was a guy called Marcus Agius, and he was a son-in-law of a Rothschild. And now the latest guy, Sharp, former Goldman Sachs. So it's British brainwashing corporation.
Yeah. What an incredible guest, folks, eh? Absolutely brilliant. I thank you on behalf of the next generation for what you're doing. And I wish everyone was as brave as you, Mario, but we can only live our lives, can't we? And we can only fight our own spiritual battles. And I think that's most important, is to work on ourselves, folks. And it's great to have a guest that's just obviously done that, and then is giving so much back to society. Mario's links will be below. Mario, I'll ask you in a moment. Let's not do it now, but I know you've got some social media and that sort of stuff, but they'll all be below, folks. Please support Mario, because we need to support the content creators that are doing their best to end the madness. And that just leaves me to say, if you could support me, I'd really appreciate it. If you could click like, subscribe, the little bell thing. And I really look forward to seeing you soon. Much, much love.